Greetings. I just completed this tonal drawing of this honeydew melon. Maria and I are well into creating the next online course, The Language of Drawing. And we're here in Chapter 5 discussing tone and value and the importance of that when drawing from observation regarding light and shadow. So it's a big chapter with a lot of information. But for now, I'm just going to try to keep this relatively simple for you to talk briefly about not just tone and value and why it's critical in drawing, but also to talk a little bit about tools and materials and how they factor in and how it's really important and critical that one become familiar with a variety of tools and materials and how they act together, what they can do, what they can't do. Well, let's first of all discuss tone and value. You know, it's interesting, a lot of people get confused by those two terms because they are really synonymous. Let me help you make the distinction. It's very simple, actually. Tone has to simply do with degrees of light to dark, the various shades of gray from white to black. Whereas value has to do with the degree of those light to darks. So one could say, for instance, that the tonal value in here is very light. The tonal value of areas that are here in the middle or over here are what we call halftones or halfway grays between white and black. And such as the dark halftones, the tonal value of these tones in here and in here are the dark halftones. So that's the distinction. It's pretty simple. Now I chose to make a larger drawing, in this case, to show artists what it is to work with various charcoal-related tools on a big scale. Now, even the materials make a difference. So, for instance, on this drawing, I chose to work with charcoal paper rather than smooth, inexpensive paper. The reason is charcoal paper, and they come in all kinds of assortments, is that it has a little texture, or what we call tooth. Now, why is that important? Well, you can build the drawing much more easily when the paper has some texture or tooth, because those ridges of the paper are literally catching the charcoal, and you have much more flexibility about how much charcoal you can add, how much more depth you can get, how much more spatial play, and even lifting out with the erasers. You just can really manipulate and model these forms so much more easily. Speaking of tools, let's discuss that for a little bit. I have a lot of favorite tools, and the interesting thing to me about tools and materials is that it's very subjective. I may introduce several tools to my artists and my students, and they may gravitate to some and not feel so great about others. And in fact, a lot of people don't even like working with charcoal because it's messy and doesn't feel good. I don't have a problem with that, but a lot of people will wear gloves, for instance, and there's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But the great thing about charcoal tools, in my opinion, as a painter and someone who enjoys drawing, is how painterly they are, the richness of these tones. I don't think you can achieve it any other way. You certainly can't do it with graphite pencils. That's a whole other matter. Well, let's discuss a few tools, and then you're going to see a quick video where I'm experimenting with tone. One of my favorite tools to start with a drawing is vine charcoal, or now they call it willow stick. It comes in a variety of shapes and sizes, from thin to thick, and it also comes in a variety of softness, from hard for really light tones to soft. I like the soft ones because it really provides a really rich degree of tone or value. The thing about the vine charcoal is that I like to start my charcoal drawings with this, with light halftones, because it's very flexible, it's easily removed and erased, and it creates a lovely series of halftones. The restriction of this tool, however, is it doesn't get that dark. I cannot get these rich blacks with this particular vine charcoal. And so for that, I go to compressed charcoals, of which there's all kinds. One of my favorites is Conte crayons, and they range also in terms of softness. My personal preference is the 2B black. It allows me to get really light halftones with a very light touch, but I can get some really deep blacks with that tool when I just add the pressure or keep repeating. So that's one of my favorites. There's another tool, compressed charcoal, that I really like. And again, these are personal preferences. You have to experiment. And that's a brand that says charcoal, and they spell it with a K-O-L-E at the end. They're these really thick, fat sticks, and they get super black. They're difficult, however, to get a light halftone with those, so I always reserve those for the halftones and the dark halftones. And then finally, of course, charcoal pencils. Again, lots to choose from. And if you go into the B series, like I do, they're going to get you really these rich dark blacks. And all these charcoal tools, by the way, are compatible. That's the beauty of it. You can go from one to the next and build and build and build. And that's, of course, experimentation. Then finally, in charcoal drawing, such as this, we always, I shouldn't say always, often, we need to subtract out the lights. And for that, I like 3 different kinds of erasers. I like the kneaded eraser. This is an old piece. You have to pull these, that's why they call them kneaded erasers. You have to knead them from getting too built up with charcoal, and then they become hard and brittle and you can't use them. So this is kneaded eraser. And they subtract very softly, which is why I enjoy them. Next, when I need to get a little more, how shall I say, a stronger eraser that can really lift out lights in the tough areas, I like to use what I call a block eraser, many different kinds. Sometimes I'll even cut these at a 45-degree angle so I can get very precise. And I can remove with the broad side of the charcoal, or I can hatch, depending. And then finally, for those tight areas, or even a more subtle hatching, I like to use different kinds of pencil erasers. And that allows me to subtract in a sort of more expressive way with hatching or getting into those really tight spots. So there you have it. It's all about personal choice. It's very subjective, but the key and I guess the message I want to send you here is that familiarizing yourself with the various tools, what they can and cannot do, is the most important thing. And you can do that without drawing anything. This is what I'm saying to you now. You'll see a video in just a moment where I'm just experimenting with what these tools can do in conjunction with one another. To sum this up, we're talking about the importance of what it is to work on a large scale with charcoal tools, the nature of tone and value and how important that is when drawing from not just observation but anything regarding light to dark, and familiarization with the tools and how subjective that can be. In the language of drawing that we're creating, I also go into graphite pencils as well, and so it's not just all about charcoal, small scale versus large. The key here, experiment, experiment, experiment. And as always, work hard and have fun. I want to take a moment here to discuss working large scale with various charcoal tools and how to push the value from light halftones to dark halftones, and also what it is to subtract. It's useful to understand how these tools work together. I've got a very large piece of vine charcoal here. Let me just begin by pushing just an area here. Just going to have this one area. Now, obviously, I'm using the broad side of the tool. If I use it very lightly, I'm going to have a light halftone. And if I push with more pressure, obviously, it's going to go darker. This particular tool is only capable of going so dark, but it's lovely for these really light halftones that you're seeing. So I like working with vine in the beginning for that reason. Now, in this area here, I'm going to create it darker, but the charcoal, this vine charcoal, is only capable of going so dark, like this. This is more pressure, obviously, and as I get darker, I'm going to move out a little bit. So there's the vine charcoal. It's very fugitive. It wipes very easily, which is also a wonderful thing. Now, to push that value darker, I go to other tools. There could be any number of compressed charcoal tools. Here I've got a Conte crayon. It's a 2B. I like it very much because it's very compatible with this. And you can see it's also capable of making a very light halftone, this Conte. And depending on what paper you work with, which is another factor, you'll see texture or you won't see texture. But here you can see that value getting darker. But I can also make subtle transitions with the with this picante, and that's why I enjoy it. There are other compressed charcoals you could work with, so you can experiment. But notice how that is now getting considerably darker. You can see the texture of the paper. Some people like that, some don't. If you don't like it, you can always use your hands, or you can use a chamois cloth to make a more even tone. There's the chamois cloth coming into play. All right. There's even other charcoal tools that can get even darker than that. Here I have what's known as charcoal. It's a brand name where they spell the C-H-A-R-K-O-L-E, and that gets even darker, and you can see that. So once again, you can experiment with these different charcoal tools from light to dark. In drawing, however, with this way, we also have to be able to subtract. Sometimes the chamois cloth can subtract, but oftentimes we have to get in there with eraser. And there are 3 different kinds of eraser that I enjoy working with. One is the kneaded eraser, this one that we pull, and that gets the tone lighter in a very subtle way. In this fashion, you can even damp it up. Even having a block eraser, and now I can begin to lift out and even hatch with this block eraser, and you can see that for a more expressive way of making that tone lighten. And finally, for more delicate or small areas, I get a pencil eraser like this one here, and that can lift out the tone delicately or with hatching as well. So I wanted to bring this up to you in order to have you understand that working with these charcoal tools, it's best to work with a variety of tools to push the values darker, but also to lighten.